Hello, my friend, and welcome to Ancient After Dark. I'm Nathaniel, and tonight I'll be your steady companion as we step gently into the story of the Roman Empire. For the next 2 hours, we'll move slowly through the empire's hidden corners, through the noise of its markets, the shadows of its palaces, and the strange humor and grandeur of its emperors and gladiators. This is not a lecture. It is a soft telling of old tales, a way for you to drift into calm while the story unfolds around you. So settle back, let your breathing grow easy, and let us begin this journey into Rome. The Roman Empire. It stretched further than most could imagine, from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germany, from the sands of Africa to the misty cliffs of Britain. It was a world of marble cities and muddy villages, of senators wrapped in togas and farmers stooped in fields. For centuries it endured, bending but never fully breaking. And in its ruins we still find pieces of ourselves, the roads, the laws, even the words we speak each day. Imagine walking into the city of Rome in the 1st century. Stone paving underfoot polished smooth by endless feet, market stalls crammed with figs, olives, and bread fresh from the oven, the air heavy with the smell of fish hauled in from the coast, smoke from cooking fires curling upward. At one corner, a baker shouts about his crust. At another, a seller swears his wine is pure, though everyone knows he watered it. Children chase one another between stalls, while the clatter of soldiers' sandals echoes through the forum. It is messy. It is loud. It is alive. And then there were the insulae, the crowded apartment blocks where most Romans lived. Tall, rickety, built of wood and brick. A family on the top floor might climb 6 flights carrying water in clay jugs. Roofs leaked when it rained, and fires spread quickly when a single lamp tipped over. Yet inside, families gathered around small hearths, cooking lentils and onions, gossiping about neighbors, laughing about the noise in the street below. For every shining palace, there were 10 cramped insulae, proof that the empire glittered but also groaned. Humor was never far from the lives of emperors. Augustus, the first emperor, insisted on modesty. He wore plain clothes, ate simple meals, and claimed to live as a humble man. Yet his family was a traveling scandal. His daughter Julia was infamous for lovers. The gossip became so loud that Augustus finally exiled her, a move that made him look more like a frustrated father than the master of the known world. Rome discovered early that emperors could control provinces, but not their children. Then there were the gladiators, men condemned as slaves or criminals, forced into the arena. Yet somehow they became the celebrities of their age. Crowds screamed their names, women scratched messages of affection on walls, even schoolboys drew pictures of their favorite fighters. It was brutal theater, but it was theater nonetheless. A gladiator might spend his days in chains and still be adored more than the senators who condemned him. Rome was strange that way. The Colosseum itself towered as a marvel, seating 50,000 people under great awnings of canvas. Vendors passed wine, bread, and sometimes olives. The roar of the crowd rolled like thunder over stone. Beneath the floor waited cages, trapdoors, and pulleys. A tiger might burst forth, or a bear chained to a post. Gladiators waited in dark corridors, hearing the crowd before seeing the light. Some prayed, others swore. All knew that once the gate opened, their fate was in the hands of strangers. And still, not every fight was to the death. A defeated man could raise a finger in appeal. The crowd roared its opinion, thumbs turned up or down depending on mood. The emperor might give the final nod, and sometimes mercy was granted. But mercy was not mercy at all. It was entertainment. The fate of a human life became another moment of drama for the restless audience. In Rome, even compassion was staged. Some emperors indulged the games beyond reason. Caligula and Nero reveled in cruelty and spectacle, while Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, often looked bored, imagining better uses for time than watching men hack one another. Still he attended, for emperors who ignored the games risked rebellion. The people wanted bread, and the people wanted games. To deny either was dangerous. Senators liked to pretend they embodied dignity, but the Senate was more rumor mill than council. Cicero thundered about corruption, but took gifts when it suited him. Deals whispered under colonnades mattered more than speeches heard aloud. The marble chamber was less noble debate, more cautious scheming about how not to end up stabbed on the steps. Rome had laws. Rome had order, but Rome also had daggers. Religion was everywhere. Temples crowded the forum. Small shrines dotted homes. A Roman could pray to Jupiter for strength, Venus for love, Mercury for luck, or Isis borrowed from Egypt. Rome was practical. If a foreign god seemed useful, they welcomed it. Some joked that Rome conquered provinces just to collect new gods, until the city was less an empire of land and more a crowded gallery of divinities. Everyday Romans hedged their bets with superstition. Amulets shaped like phalluses were worn against the evil eye. Chickens were sacrificed before journeys. Priests studied the flight of birds for omens. One poet sneered that it was easier to find a god in Rome than a man. And in a way, he was right. Every street corner offered incense to some deity, as if heaven itself was being drafted into Rome's daily bureaucracy. And then there was Tiberius, brooding on the island of Capri, letting rumors swirl about his habits. Caligula claimed divinity outright, and supposedly appointed his horse as priest, though even ancient historians wondered if that was satire or madness. Nero believed himself an artist, forcing senators to clap at his singing. Many Romans whispered that emperors were meant to lead armies, not chorus lines, but emperors rarely listened. Humor clung to names as well. A general who ate too much was called Piglet. A senator who spoke endlessly was nicknamed Endless Scroll. Even emperors were not spared. Vespasian once introduced a tax on public toilets. When mocked, he held up a coin and said, "Money does not smell," proving that wit was sometimes the only weapon sharper than a sword. And then there were the legions, the backbone of the empire, disciplined, relentless, feared across the world. Soldiers marched with packs heavier than their bodies. They built roads and forts as they advanced. A legionary's camp was laid with strict order, streets cut with ropes and pegs. Every camp a tiny Rome planted on foreign soil. Soldiers complained endlessly of barley rations, strict centurions, and endless drills. But their discipline made them unstoppable. Trade fed the empire as much as swords. Grain from Egypt filled granaries. Olive oil from Spain slicked the amphorae. Wine from Gaul perfumed banquets. Silk came along winding routes from Asia. Spices from India flavored Roman dishes. The rich boasted of flamingo tongues and dormice stuffed with honey. Though most Romans ate bread and porridge, a satirist joked that Rome conquered the world just to give its rich indigestion. Entertainment stretched beyond the arena. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew crowds even greater than the Colosseum. The red, the blue, the green, and the white teams had fan bases as rabid as any modern club. Riots broke out if results seemed unfair. At times, thousands died in brawls over horse races, proving that human passion for sports chaos is timeless. At home, Romans found amusement in dice, board games, and gossip. Children played with dolls carved of terracotta, or rolled hoops along the streets. A soldier far away might carve a wooden horse and send it home to his son, reminding us that even under marble arches, life was still measured in small moments. The baths were Rome's social glue, vast complexes with hot pools, cold dips, steam rooms, and gardens. Men gathered to gossip, strike deals, and argue about politics while attendants poured oil on their backs. The baths were cleaner than the streets, but just as full of intrigue. A place where senators could relax their togas and plot all the same. At night, the city shifted again. Lamps flickered across insulae. Taverns filled with drinkers. Streets echoed with laughter and shouts. The rich reclined at banquets listening to music, while the poor crowded into upper apartments hoping the building would not collapse. Rome never truly slept. It just dimmed, drifting between the roar of markets and the hush of alleys. And here is where we leave the first stretch of our walk through Rome. We have glimpsed its markets, its senators, its emperors and gladiators, and the quiet humor that seeped even into its marble. The empire was never only one thing. It was grandeur and grime, cruelty and comedy, discipline and disorder. The emperors of Rome were both rulers and performers. Each one inherited not only armies and treasuries, but also the endless gaze of the people. Some tried to look modest, others embraced extravagance. Each became a character in a story that citizens whispered about over bread and wine. The emperor was never just a man. He was theater in human form. Claudius, for example, began his reign as a surprise. He was thought too awkward, too weak, and often overlooked by his own family. Some claimed he stammered, others thought he limped. For years, he was mocked quietly behind curtains. Yet when assassins murdered Caligula, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius trembling behind a tapestry and declared him emperor. A man who hid from death became ruler of the empire. Rome enjoyed such ironies. He proved more capable than expected, reorganizing provinces, expanding the empire into Britain, and strengthening laws. Yet still, whispers never stopped. One poet suggested Rome was ruled not by a man, but by chance itself. For if fate could lift a stammering scholar to the purple, then anything was possible. Ordinary Romans likely chuckled. If the emperor could stumble into power, maybe fortune might stumble into their kitchens as well. Of course, not all emperors stumbled. Some sprinted headfirst into scandal. Nero is remembered less for policies, more for spectacles. He fancied himself a musician, forcing senators to endure long performances. The empire was vast, yet the most powerful men in it could not leave the theater until Nero finished strumming. Citizens joked that during one concert, Rome prayed for a barbarian invasion to cut it short. For in Rome, conquering armies were less frightening than an emperor's bad singing. Nero also dreamed in grand gestures. He envisioned a golden house, a palace sprawling with gardens, artificial lakes, and a colossal statue of himself. To build it, he cleared huge parts of the city after a fire. Some claimed he started the blaze himself, though others argued it was simply mismanaged chaos. What mattered was not guilt, but perception. And perception clung to Nero like smoke. The idea that the emperor fiddled while Rome burned never faded. Beyond emperors, daily life in the capital carried its own drama. Public fountains flowed with water from aqueducts, yet thieves tapped pipes and diverted streams. Bakers claimed their loaves were pure wheat, yet stretched them with ash. Or worse, senators scolded about morality, then slipped quietly into brothels. Rome was a city that proclaimed virtue loudly, while practicing something else in the shadows. Citizens learned to smile at statues and roll their eyes in private. Festivals filled the calendar. Each god had days of celebration. Some were solemn, others wild. The Saturnalia in December was the loudest of all. Masters and slaves exchanged roles for a time. Dice were played openly. Gifts were given. Streets erupted in song and mischief. Some compared it to a carnival. Others muttered it was proof that Romans loved chaos more than order. Saturnalia was the one time of year when pretending vanished, and people simply enjoyed being noisy. Markets were hubs not only of trade, but of gossip. A butcher might sell lamb while muttering about the governor's new mistress. A spice merchant from Syria told tales of caravans attacked by bandits. A farmer complained of taxes higher than his harvest. The forum was less a marketplace of goods, more a marketplace of rumors. Anyone seeking truth in Rome had to sift carefully, for every fact was wrapped in 3 layers of exaggeration. The Circus Maximus, larger than the Colosseum, was Rome's true addiction. Chariots thundered around the track, horses straining, wheels wobbling dangerously. 4 factions battled for glory: reds, blues, greens, and whites. Supporters pledged their loyalty with the passion of soldiers. Families even passed down allegiance from father to son. A man could change his toga, change his job, even change his god, but never his team. Riots broke out often when races ended badly. One story told of fans so enraged that stalls were torn apart, fires set, and entire neighborhoods caught in the madness. Some emperors encouraged the chaos, others feared it, but all knew one truth: if you controlled the races, you controlled the mood of the people. A senator might spend days debating laws, but one crooked turn of a chariot could undo it all. In quieter corners, Roman homes reflected their owners' fortunes. The rich decorated floors with mosaics, colored stones arranged into images of gods, fish, or battles. Walls were painted with bright frescoes of gardens and birds, designed to make rooms feel larger than they were. The poor, by contrast, were lucky if their walls held plaster long enough to keep out the wind. Yet even in the humblest homes, small shrines to household gods burned with offerings, reminding families that divinity could live in any corner. Education was valued, though not equally. Boys of wealth studied rhetoric, philosophy, and history under stern tutors. They practiced speeches that few would ever hear. Girls were less often schooled, though some learned letters and arithmetic if their parents allowed. In poorer families, education was life itself. A boy learning to cut stone from his father, or a girl learning to weave from her mother. Rome believed knowledge was power, but it never decided who deserved power most. The army remained Rome's steel backbone, and life in the legion was relentless. Soldiers marched 20 miles a day carrying armor, weapons, rations, and stakes to build camp defenses. Every evening, no matter how tired, they constructed a fortified camp. Ditches were dug, palisades raised, tents set in perfect rows. Some grumbled they built more camps than fought battles. Still, their discipline was unmatched, and their presence carved Roman order into distant lands. When wars paused, soldiers sometimes amused themselves with crude jokes. Carvings on walls survive, scratched by bored legionaries in far provinces. One drawing shows a donkey crucified, mocking a comrade's faith. Another depicts a general with an oversized nose, proving that humor marched as far as legions did. If discipline was Rome's sword, laughter was its shield against monotony. Religion continued to weave through every moment. Augurs watched the skies for bird patterns. Haruspices slit open animals to read futures from entrails. A farmer might cross himself not against sin, but against unlucky omens. Rome's religion was less about faith, more about contract. If a man offered the right sacrifice, he expected the god to hold up their end. It was transactional spirituality, gods as bureaucrats of the divine. Some mocked that Rome had turned heaven into another senate. among common people. Street life kept its rhythm. Bakers shouted prices. Beggars rattled bowls. Prostitutes called softly from doorways. Pickpockets drifted like smoke through the crowd. Rome was alive with every layer of society at once. The rich were carried in litters. The poor dodged beneath. Senators wrapped themselves in white togas. Thieves wrapped themselves in the crowd. It was a place where everything existed together. Grandeur and grime without separation. The food of Rome mirrored its society, simple for most, lavish for a few. Grain porridge flavored with herbs fed the masses, while elites nibbled peacock tongues and honeyed dormice. Banquets stretched late into the night with dishes meant more for spectacle than taste. Philosophers noted that more Romans died of indulgence than of battle. A sly jab, but perhaps true, for in Rome the stomach was often treated with more reverence than the gods. Bathhouses tied the city together. A man could wake, visit the baths, exercise, gossip, soak, and leave cleaner in body, if not in conscience. They were social hubs where senators rubbed shoulders with soldiers, and merchants cut deals over steam. Rules separated men and women at times, but rules bent easily in Rome. One wit claimed that if the city ever burned again, citizens would flee first to the baths, and only afterward to their families. The provinces of the empire offered variety beyond measure. In Egypt, temples of ancient gods still rose above fields of grain. In Gaul, tribes learned Latin even as they grumbled in their own tongues. In Britain, soldiers cursed the endless rain. In Africa, markets rang with the cries of traders. The empire was less one body than many, stitched together by roads and armies, and held only as long as the thread of discipline did not snap. Governors sent to distant lands often found themselves the butt of jokes. One was mocked for arriving in Spain and promptly declaring himself a wine expert after a single sip. Another demanded a parade for winning a skirmish so small it was over before his toga was fastened. Rome gave men power quickly and laughed when they proved unworthy of it. Satire was as much a weapon as a sword, and no man, not even an emperor, was fully safe from it. Life in the city of Rome was never truly still. Even in its quietest hours, the streets carried footsteps, the creak of carts, the distant splash of fountains. By dawn, the forum filled again. Senators in their stiff white togas pretending at gravity, merchants shouting at one another about olive oil quality, beggars positioning themselves at temple steps for the best chance at charity. The empire's heart beat not in silence, but in constant noise and motion. The senators were often painted as men of dignity, yet their real skill was survival. They argued loudly about honor in the daylight and whispered about bribes in the evening. A senator might praise an emperor one day and denounce him the next if daggers shifted direction. One wag once said the Senate was not the pillar of Rome, but the weather vane, always turning whichever way the storm blew. Emperors knew this and kept them in check. Domitian, for instance, preferred suspicion over trust. He surrounded himself with spies, punished critics harshly, and insisted on being addressed as master and god. Yet behind closed doors he feared assassination at every corner, and with reason. In the end, he was stabbed in his own palace, proving that paranoia in Rome was not a flaw, but a survival skill that failed only once. Not every emperor leaned on fear alone. Trajan, for example, was celebrated as a conqueror and a builder. He extended the empire to its greatest reach, annexing Dacia and scattering wealth through triumphs. In the Forum, his great column rose, spiraled with carved images of soldiers crossing rivers and storming forts. Ordinary citizens gazed up at it and saw not stone, but the empire's story etched in marble. Some joked, however, that if every soldier carved on the column were real, there would have been no one left to farm Italy. Hadrian, Trajan's successor, shifted course. Where Trajan expanded, Hadrian consolidated. He traveled the empire endlessly, inspecting legions, ordering cities to be strengthened, and in Britain, he built a wall, not merely to keep out tribes, but to mark the edge of what Rome dared hold. The wall was stone and turf, but it was also a line in the sand. Hadrian preferred limits, a rare trait in Rome where expansion was usually the only vocabulary. He also left a strange mark on the city, the Pantheon, rebuilt under his watch. Its dome rose wider than any before, with the great oculus in the center open to the sky. Rain fell through that circle. Sunlight cut beams across marble floors. It felt less like a temple, more like a monument to possibility. Even now it remains, stubbornly defying time, a reminder that Rome dreamed as much as it conquered. Yet Hadrian's life was not without irony. He adored Greek culture, filled his villas with statues and philosophers, and encouraged arts and learning. But he also ordered executions of senators he disliked, proving again that Romans could blend philosophy with brutality without blinking. The empire thrived on contradiction, and emperors embodied it best. While emperors schemed, the streets had their own rhythm. Bakers pulled bread from clay ovens, butchers cut meat on wooden blocks, barbers shaved men while muttering gossip in their ears. A barber shop was less for grooming, more for news. One customer joked once that a man entered hairy and ignorant and left smooth and misinformed. Still, for many Romans, it was their only news source that did not involve a soldier shouting orders. Food markets offered color and chaos, olives glistening in baskets, fish laid out with glassy eyes, fruit stacked in pyramids that toppled at the slightest nudge. Vendors shouted louder than one another, trying to draw attention. Housewives inspected produce with suspicion, knowing sellers stretched truth as easily as dough. A buyer might hold up a fig, sigh, and still purchase it, because arguing for an hour over fruit was part of the ritual. The aqueducts, carrying water from distant hills, were another marvel. Arches marched across valleys, stone fitted so carefully that water flowed steady for miles. Public fountains spouted clear streams into basins where citizens filled jars. In poorer homes, these fountains were the only water supply. Children splashed in them despite stern looks from their mothers. Philosophers noted that an empire that could bring water from mountains to city corners could surely last forever. They were wrong, but the water kept flowing anyway. Bathhouses were fed by these aqueducts, and no Roman city was complete without them. Inside, men stripped down, oiled themselves, exercised, and then lounged in hot pools or cold dips. Attendants scraped skin with strigils. Merchants whispered about contracts, and senators plotted without their togas. Some visitors admitted they cared little for cleanliness, and more for the chance to overhear secrets floating in steam. If Rome ran on bread and games, it also ran on gossip. Education remained a prized path for the elite. Boys learned from tutors, reciting Homer, Virgil, and endless rules of rhetoric. They practiced speeches about imaginary laws, preparing for a Senate where speeches often mattered less than bribes. Girls of wealthier homes learned to manage households, accounts, and servants. Some became literate, but many were taught that their strength lay in weaving, not writing. Philosophers occasionally questioned this division, but few dared loudly, for tradition was as strong as marble. Still, clever women shaped Rome quietly. Some managed estates, others influenced politics through marriages and networks. Livia, wife of Augustus, was whispered to have poisoned rivals and maneuvered her son Tiberius to power, whether true or not. The stories reveal how Romans believed women worked power from the shadows. If the Senate was marble, women were the mortar holding it unseen. Religion, as always, was both glue and theater. Emperors were often deified after death. Whether they deserved it or not, Augustus became divine, and temples rose to him. Caligula demanded divinity in life, with less success. Priests oversaw sacrifices, augurs read birds, and haruspices still probed entrails for omens. Many citizens likely believed sincerely, but many also smirked. A poet once joked that the gods were busier than the postal service with all the sacrifices they were supposed to process each day. The empire stretched across cultures, and so it absorbed gods endlessly. From Egypt came Isis, from Persia, Mithras, from Gaul, strange deities tied to rivers and stones. Rome tolerated them all, provided they bowed eventually to the emperor's authority. Religion became less about exclusion, more about collection. Like a wealthy man gathering statues in his villa, Rome gathered gods for its shelves, until the shelves threatened to collapse. Amid all this grandeur and variety, the poor still filled the majority of the city. Their lives were lived in cramped insulae, climbing creaking stairs with jars of water, cooking lentils over small braziers, hoping their building would not burn before dawn. Fires were so common that even emperors passed laws demanding fire brigades. Yet still, flames swept through districts regularly. Street entertainment provided relief. Jugglers tossed knives for coins, musicians plucked strings, dancers whirled in dust. Crowds gathered quickly, then scattered just as quickly when guards appeared. For even entertainment without permission could be treated as disorder. Still, the streets laughed often, and laughter was sometimes the only currency the poor could afford freely. The Forum, Rome's center, remained both majestic and ridiculous. Senators strutted, philosophers argued, merchants haggled, and in the same space criminals were tried. Triumphs marched through with elephants and prisoners. Then the next day, bakers shouted about stale loaves. The forum was Rome condensed. Grandeur beside triviality, wisdom beside foolishness. In marble halls, decisions shaped the world, while in the same marble pigeons left their mark freely. And always, there was spectacle. Gladiatorial games roared in the Colosseum. Animal hunts thrilled with lions and leopards brought from Africa. Staged naval battles flooded arenas with water to float ships inside. The sheer logistics were staggering. Engineers designed hidden elevators, trap doors, and winches to surprise audiences. Citizens clapped in wonder not only at the fighters, but at the machines that delivered them. Rome worshipped engineering as much as courage. The crowds themselves could be fickle, cheering one moment, booing the next. A gladiator could be adored one day, and forgotten the next if he lost. The same for emperors, adored at their triumphs, despised at their taxes. Rome's affection was as steady as shifting sand. Politicians joked privately that the empire was not ruled by emperors, but by the appetite of the mob. Feed them, amuse them, and they were loyal. Deny them, and no legion could hold them still. The emperors of Rome were often remembered less for what they built, and more for what people whispered about them afterward. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, inherited one of the strongest empires in history, and somehow managed to turn it into a stage for his own ego. He fancied himself a gladiator, appearing in the arena with wooden swords so no real harm could come to him. Citizens muttered that Rome had once conquered the world with iron, and now its emperor fought it with props. He styled himself as Hercules reborn, even ordering statues of the demigod to be remade in his likeness. The Senate tried to smile politely, while privately joking that the only thing Commodus wrestled successfully was his own reflection. Eventually, his paranoia grew so deep that conspirators ended him in his bath, proving that even men who thought themselves gods were still vulnerable to soap and assassins. Beyond the palaces, Roman engineers shaped the empire in ways still visible. The roads, stretching like veins across continents, were not only for armies, but for traders, couriers, and even casual travelers. Milestones dotted the routes, reminding every walker that they moved within the embrace of Rome. One writer claimed that a Roman soldier could march from one end of the empire to the other without losing sight of civilization. A bold claim, though anyone who had slogged through Britannia's reign might have argued otherwise. The aqueducts, too, were marvels. Arched structures marching over valleys, carrying water by the steady pull of gravity. Cities thrived because of them. Fountains bubbled, baths steamed, gardens flourished. Citizens joked that Rome's gods might control the heavens, but engineers controlled the earth. And in a way, that was the empire's secret. It conquered not just with swords, but with stone. Daily meals reflected class divides. The wealthy reclined at banquets, sampling exotic dishes more designed to shock than to nourish. Roasted peacocks with feathers reattached, pigs stuffed with smaller animals, sauces so spiced that the taste of actual food disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, the poor survived on bread, porridge, and the occasional vegetable stew. A philosopher once remarked that the poor ate to live, while the rich ate to regret. Rome's stomach told as many stories as its armies. Banquets themselves were theater. Guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables. Servants poured wine endlessly. Musicians plucked strings. Dancers performed. Poets recited flattering verses. The host smiled broadly, while praying silently that no guest choked on a fishbone and turned dinner into scandal. Vomitoriums are often imagined as special rooms, but in truth, the term referred to passageways in amphitheaters. Still, guests did sometimes excuse themselves to make more room for indulgence, proving again that Romans could turn even digestion into spectacle. Art and literature flourished alongside excess. Virgil, Ovid, Horace. Their works became pillars of Roman identity. Virgil's Aeneid cast Rome as the destined inheritor of Troy's legacy. Ovid, meanwhile, filled verses with love, desire, and occasional mischief. His wit was sharp enough that Augustus exiled him for it, proving that emperors might tolerate corruption, but not clever poetry at their expense. Rome liked art, as long as it knew when to flatter. Theaters hosted plays that ranged from comedies mocking everyday life to tragedies filled with gods and fate. Actors were often looked down upon socially, yet adored by crowds, a contradiction mirrored throughout Roman society, where status and popularity rarely aligned. A senator might frown at a performer in public, then invite him privately to recite at his villa. Hypocrisy was Rome's most consistent tradition. The legions remained Rome's backbone. Each soldier carried the short sword, the gladius, designed for stabbing rather than slashing. Shields overlapped in formations, creating the famous testudo, or tortoise. Arrows clattered harmlessly on their shells of wood and iron, marching forward steadily. In discipline, they were unmatched, yet they also grumbled endlessly. Soldiers complained of endless digging, building camps, hauling supplies. Some joked they were less warriors than mules who occasionally fought. In the provinces, legions often doubled as builders, constructing bridges, roads, and fortifications. Towns sprang up near forts. Merchants followed soldiers. And soon, what began as a camp became a city. Romanization spread less by decree and more by the steady tread of hobnailed sandals. Where soldiers slept, Rome eventually stayed. Religious cults grew in popularity among soldiers, especially the cult of Mithras, worshipped in underground chambers. Mithras was depicted slaying a bull, a symbol wrapped in mystery. Initiates met in secret, shared meals, and swore brotherhood. Some emperors frowned at the secrecy, but tolerated it. After all, men willing to fight for Rome could worship whichever bulls they pleased, as long as taxes arrived on time. Back in the capital, architecture spoke louder than speeches. Triumphal arches celebrated victories. Temples honored gods and emperors alike. Forums expanded, each emperor eager to leave his mark in stone. Rome was a city of constant construction and equally constant ruin. Buildings collapsed as often as they rose. Fires swept through neighborhoods. Earthquakes rattled the peninsula, yet always the city rebuilt. As one poet quipped, Rome was eternal, mostly because its builders never got a day off. Amid grandeur, crime thrived. Pickpockets worked the crowded baths. Robbers haunted dark alleys. Gangs fought turf wars in the Suburra district. The Praetorian Guard protected emperors, but ordinary citizens often relied on neighbors more than soldiers. Even in the empire's heart, danger lingered. A philosopher mused that living in Rome was proof of courage in itself, and perhaps he was not wrong. Entertainment filled every spare moment. Gladiatorial combat dominated, but beast hunts were nearly as popular. Lions, leopards, crocodiles, even giraffes were paraded into arenas for astonished crowds. Animals were shipped from across the empire, often at staggering cost. A governor once bankrupted himself importing hippos, only to discover they were less entertaining than expected, proving again that spectacle in Rome was often measured less in quality and more in expense. Chariot racing remained the obsession of the masses. The factions of reds, blues, greens, and whites consumed loyalty beyond reason. Men tattooed colors on their skin. Women prayed for their team's victory. Fortunes rose and fell on wagers. Emperors understood that a charioteer's popularity could rival their own. One driver, beloved by the Greens, supposedly earned more in prizes than most senators. His horses were cheered louder than imperial decrees. In Rome, power could ride on 4 legs. In quieter moments, families gathered in courtyards of villas, shaded by vines. Water trickled from fountains. Children recited lessons or played with knucklebones, while elders shared tales of ancestors who fought in wars long past. Domestic life was rarely as dramatic as history suggests, but it was steady. The empire endured not just because of armies, but because families raised new generations beneath tiled roofs. Stability rested as much in bread ovens as in palaces. Slavery underpinned much of Roman society. Slaves worked fields, mines, households. Some were treated brutally. Others managed shops and businesses on behalf of their masters. Freedom was sometimes granted after years of service. A freedman might even become wealthy. Though stigma lingered, Romans often joked bitterly that they were ruled by their own former slaves. And in some cases, they were not wrong. The tension between classes was constant. The elite lived in marble villas with mosaics underfoot. while the poor huddled in wooden shacks above noisy streets. Bread and circuses were meant to pacify them. Grain-dole distributions filled bellies, games filled minds, yet riots still broke out, sparked by hunger or unfair taxes or sheer exhaustion with promises never kept. Emperors feared mobs more than foreign enemies, for foreign armies had to cross borders, but mobs were already inside the city. Literacy and writing tied Rome together. Inscriptions carved on stone, graffiti scribbled on walls, scrolls read aloud in forums, even love notes scratched on wax tablets. The empire spoke in many voices and left them everywhere. A soldier scrawled a message in Pompeii declaring his contempt for the local tavern. A woman left graffiti celebrating her lover's skill. A shopkeeper carved prices into his stall. Rome's voices lingered in every crack of plaster. Philosophy too found a place. Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. They wrote of stoicism, of enduring fate with calm, of recognizing what one could control and what one could not. Ironically, their words were often penned between palace plots, prison sentences, or battlefield campaigns. The empire's philosophers taught peace while living in chaos. Rome was a city that could read about tranquility while shouting in the streets outside. And yet, despite chaos, Rome endured. Its stones rose, its people multiplied, its armies marched, and its stories spread. It was never stable, never fully peaceful, never purely noble. Yet it lasted longer than almost any empire before or after. Perhaps because Rome accepted its contradictions and turned them into spectacle. The festivals of Rome offered windows into its heart. For a people who praised discipline and order, they also loved chaos when the calendar allowed it. The Lupercalia, celebrated in February, saw priests running through the streets half naked, striking passers-by with strips of goat hide. Women welcomed the blows, believing it would grant fertility. Outsiders found the practice absurd. Romans called it tradition, and no tradition ever needed more explanation than that. Other festivals were gentler. The Floralia honored the goddess of flowers, with plays, dancing, and bright displays of blossoms across the city. The Consualia celebrated the god of grain storage, when horses and donkeys were rested in his honor. Some citizens joked the animals looked happier during those days than their owners did all year, for even beasts of burden enjoyed rare holidays in Rome. Among the strangest were private cults. The cult of Bacchus, god of wine, was accused of wild rites, drunken gatherings, and secret plots. The Senate outlawed it at times. Though suppression rarely lasted, Romans might pretend to disapprove, but secretly enjoyed the idea of forbidden revelry. If an empire could conquer nations, surely it could also tolerate neighbors singing too loudly in the night. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, also gained followers. Her temples stood along the Tiber, painted with bright colors and lined with statues. Romans sought her for healing, love, and protection at sea. Sailors prayed to her before voyages, believing her blessings steadied ships. Some senators sneered at foreign gods, but common folk cared less. If a goddess promised safety, who questioned her passport? And then there was Mithras, adored by soldiers. Worship took place underground, in dim chambers decorated with scenes of the god slaying a bull. Initiates gathered for ritual meals, sharing bread and wine in tight brotherhood. To outsiders, it looked mysterious. To members, it was comfort. In every far-flung camp, the cult of Mithras gave soldiers the sense that even at the edge of the world, they belonged. Amid rituals, Romans also endured disasters. Fires swept through neighborhoods regularly, destroying Insulae in hours. The Great Fire under Nero consumed vast districts, leaving thousands homeless. Earthquakes shook cities in Campania, and in 79 CE, Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash. Some survivors claimed they saw gods in the smoke. Others simply fled barefoot through the chaos, proving that in Rome, myth and survival often walked side by side. Pompeii preserved details of life in ways no other city did. Graffiti scrawled across walls, election notices painted on corners, bakery ovens still holding bread turned to stone. Even taverns with counters and jars remain visible. One inscription reads, "We have drunk, we have eaten, now we must go," proving that some human truths endure better than marble. Public health was always a concern in crowded Rome. Sewers like the Cloaca Maxima drained waste into the Tiber. Yet the river remained foul. Streets reeked with refuse. Rats thrived alongside cats and dogs. Physicians offered remedies ranging from herbs to charms. A man with a fever might be bled by a doctor or prayed over by a priest. Neither guaranteed success. The line between medicine and superstition blurred as easily as chalk on stone. Education remained prized, but often impractical. Boys memorized endless speeches by Cicero, though few would ever address a senate. They recited poetry about virtue, then watched senators sell laws to the highest bidder. A boy might practice orations about bravery, while his father bribed tax collectors. The contradiction did not escape notice. Rome trained its youth in ideals, then taught them the opposite in practice. Still, some students excelled. Lawyers rose through courts with eloquence. Poets captured attention with verses. Philosophers wrote treatises on duty, fate, and justice. Stoicism flourished, teaching acceptance of life's burdens. The irony was that its most famous voice, Marcus Aurelius, wrote meditations on calm while ruling during wars and plagues. Rome treasured philosophy, as long as it came in scroll form and not in political speeches. Military life continued to shape the empire. Legions defended frontiers in Dacia, Syria, and Britannia. Soldiers constructed forts and roads, carrying the order of Rome into forests and deserts. Along the Rhine and Danube, they faced tribes eager to test borders. In the east, they confronted Parthian cavalry, swift horse archers who harried from afar. Every frontier told a different story, some of conquest, some of uneasy truce, all of endless vigilance. Soldiers left their mark on every land. In Britain, altars to local gods stood beside dedications to Jupiter. In Gaul, Roman villas rose near Celtic shrines. In the deserts of Syria, aqueducts cut across dry valleys. Wherever legions camped, Rome settled permanently. Rome's footprint spread not by words, but by trenches dug, walls raised, and watchfires lit at night. Inside the capital, politics churned. Senators squabbled. Consuls jostled for attention. Praetors issued decrees. The system looked orderly, yet chaos lurked under the marble. Elections were manipulated, votes bought, promises made then discarded. A senator might rise with dignity in the morning and spend the evening begging a freedman for loans. Power in Rome was less ladder, more circus rope, easy to climb but easier to fall from. Emperors who pleased the people lasted longer. Those who displeased them found daggers waiting. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, each paid the price for arrogance. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect, also became kingmakers. They placed emperors on the throne and removed them with equal ease. Citizens joked that loyalty of the guard lasted exactly as long as their pay. Rome's throne was gilded, but it never stopped shaking. Luxury shaped elite lives. Villas lined with mosaics, gardens shaded by colonnades, banquets dripping with excess, marble imported from far quarries decorated walls, glassware gleamed on tables. Silk robes shimmered despite senators passing laws against them. Laws against luxury were written regularly, ignored even more regularly. A Roman elite believed strongly in moderation. As long as moderation applied to his neighbor, the poor endured differently. Their entertainment was bread doles, street performances, and gossip. Families crowded into rooms barely large enough for bedding. Rats scurried in shadows. Roofs leaked in rain. Fires frightened constantly, yet laughter still echoed. Children played games with stones. Neighbors shared bread when they had little. Joy was not absent, only frugal. One writer noted that the poor lived closer to one another, and perhaps closer to life itself. Religion offered comfort. Shrines stood in kitchens with figures of the lares, household gods. Offerings of wine, bread, and incense kept them appeased. Families prayed for protection. Soldiers prayed for survival. Farmers prayed for rain. Faith tied together all levels of society. No feast began without sacrifice. No journey without omen. A Roman could live without luxury, but rarely without ritual. Stranger cults appeared too. Astrology flourished, with citizens consulting charts to choose marriages or journeys. Amulets against curses sold briskly. Love spells were scratched on lead tablets and tossed into wells. Even emperors consulted astrologers. Despite pretending disdain, skeptics mocked openly, but still carried charms in their tunics. For in Rome, disbelief was safer when paired with insurance. The empire's frontiers grew restless. Germanic tribes pressed the Rhine. Parthians schemed in the east. Pirates raided coasts despite Rome's fleets. The empire was vast, but vastness bred cracks. Roads carried armies swiftly, but also rumors faster. A rebellion in one province could echo across seas in weeks. Rome lived in grandeur, but always on guard. Its size was both triumph and burden. And still, culture thrived. Artists painted frescoes of gardens so lifelike that birds seemed perched in plaster. Sculptors carved marble with veins so fine they looked like living skin. Writers produced plays mocking neighbors and praising gods. Musicians filled banquets with flutes and lyres. The empire was no single thing, but a constant mixture. Steel and stone balanced with verse and melody. Citizens might shout at races in the morning, sacrifice at noon, and listen to poetry by dusk. A day in Rome was never dull. The emperors who followed brought their own peculiarities to the stage of Rome. Some were remembered for wisdom, others for cruelty, but many for quirks so strange that historians wrote them down in disbelief. Elagabalus, for instance, a boy emperor from Syria, became infamous for extravagance. He introduced a foreign sun god as Rome's chief deity, married a Vestal virgin against sacred rules, and once served banquets where guests ate peacock and nightingale tongues while being buried under rose petals. Ancient writers claim some diners suffocated beneath the flowers. Whether true or not, it proved that Rome could turn even botany into disaster. His reign did not last long. Assassins ended him in a latrine at only 18. The empire had seen emperors killed in battle, others by poison, but few by the indignity of bathroom walls. Romans found irony in everything, and the empire often supplied it freely. After such chaos, Septimius Severus tried to restore order. He was a soldier at heart, stern and pragmatic. He told his sons on his deathbed, "Enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else." It was cynical advice, but accurate. For in Rome, emperors survived not on virtue, but on loyalty bought with coin. Soldiers cheered him, citizens tolerated him, senators endured him. Rome marched on, one denarius at a time. His son, Caracalla, followed, remembered most for granting Roman citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire. Historians debate his motives. Some said it was generosity. Others said he simply wanted more taxpayers. The people joked that Caracalla was proof citizenship could be given away like festival bread. To add to his legend, he also built the grand baths of Rome, enormous complexes with gardens, pools, and libraries. Some muttered it was the only good thing he left behind, apart from an emptier treasury. The baths themselves dazzled visitors. Hot rooms, cold plunges, steaming halls, exercise yards filled with men lifting weights carved of stone, pools reflecting mosaics of gods. Citizens lounged for hours discussing politics, gossip, or debating whether the latest emperor deserved praise or poison. It was said one could spend an entire day at the baths, and many did, emerging cleaner in body, though not always in conscience. While emperors struggled for control, the provinces carried the empire's true weight. In Gaul, Roman villas stood beside Celtic shrines, Latin blended with native tongues, roads cut through forests, carrying wine and weapons alike. In Egypt, the grain harvest fed the capital, while ancient temples to Isis and Osiris stood beside new shrines to Jupiter. In Britannia, soldiers cursed the endless rain, watching smoke rise from tribal villages beyond Hadrian's Wall. The empire was less uniform, more patchwork stitched by legionary hands. In North Africa, cities like Carthage and Leptis Magna flourished with markets, theaters, and aqueducts. Olive oil flowed from their presses into amphorae bound for Rome. Statues lined their forums, proving Rome's style traveled farther than its language. Some locals embraced Roman culture eagerly, others quietly resisted. A Roman governor once remarked that the province seemed peaceful only because rebellion was waiting for better weather. Meanwhile, in the east, Rome confronted Parthia, a rival empire with skilled cavalry. Horse archers harassed Roman legions. Armored cataphracts thundered across plains. Wars seesawed for generations. Each side claimed victory, but neither erased the other. Romans muttered that Parthians were like flies, impossible to swat entirely. Yet the standoff defined the eastern frontier for centuries. Trade connected these worlds. Silk arrived from China, ivory from Africa, spices from India, amber from northern forests. Rome consumed them greedily, though most citizens never tasted silk or spice. Those luxuries remained for the wealthy. A satirist remarked that Romans conquered lands only to fill stomachs with things they could not pronounce. Even so, the empire's roads and seas buzzed with merchants, proof that Rome's appetite was as mighty as its legions. The city of Rome itself groaned under growth. Its population swelled to over 1 million. A size unmatched until modern times. Crowded streets rang with voices. Carts jammed alleys. Sewage stank beneath beauty. Wealthy villas glittered beside crumbling insulae. The empire's heart was both jewel and ulcer. Emperors tried reforms, but the city remained unruly. Some joked that even the gods avoided Rome after dark, preferring quieter temples abroad. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect emperors, grew into kingmakers. They elevated rulers, then killed them when bribes ran dry. An emperor who forgot to pay their donatives risked a dagger in his sleep. Citizens whispered that Rome was not ruled by emperors, but by whichever guardsman held the keys to the palace gate. Loyalty had a price, and it was always rising. Lawyers thrived in such instability. Courts bustled with disputes over inheritance, contracts, and property. Advocates delivered long speeches and flowing rhetoric, often more performance than logic. Juries swayed less by truth and more by how amusing the orator could be. Some trials dragged for years, not for justice, but for entertainment. Rome's courts proved that drama was not confined to theaters. It spilled freely into law. Slavery underpinned much of this order. Slaves worked fields, households, and businesses. Some were chained in mines, others educated as tutors or accountants. A few earned freedom and wealth, but most labored invisibly. Romans justified it as natural, claiming victory in war entitled them to labor. Philosophers occasionally questioned the practice, but quietly, for their villas also ran on slave hands. Freedom and morality rarely shared the same table. Despite hardship, laughter persisted. Graffiti scrawled across Pompeii's walls included jokes about innkeepers, crude drawings of gladiators, even insults about local politicians. One reads simply, "I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins from bearing so many tedious scribblings," proving that even ancient Romans were tired of endless political ads. Humor was as permanent as stone, even if its targets shifted. Public entertainment soothed tension. Gladiators drew crowds, but beast hunts enthralled too. Elephants marched into arenas, leopards leapt from cages, ostriches bewildered the audience by running aimlessly. Exotic animals fascinated and terrified. Citizens marveled at creatures they had never imagined. Some asked if Romans conquered the world only to empty its forests. Yet applause drowned hesitation. Rome demanded spectacle above all else. Chariot races remained the city's obsession. Rivalries between teams consumed entire districts. The blues and greens often clashed violently. In later centuries, these rivalries became so intense that they toppled cities. But even in earlier days, a poor man might risk his life defending his faction's honor. The irony was that most teams were owned by the same wealthy patrons. Citizens fought fiercely over colors, while their masters counted profits together. Rome's passion was often misplaced, but it was never half-hearted. Religious life expanded in complexity. Temples to Jupiter and Venus still rose, but household shrines honored countless minor deities. Romans prayed to spirits guarding doorways, fields, and crossroads. Superstition filled gaps where faith faltered. Fortune tellers thrived, casting dice, reading palms, or peering into bowls of water. Even emperors consulted them while pretending disdain. Faith in Rome was less about doctrine, more about insurance against fate. Philosophy remained fashionable, though often mocked. Stoics preached virtue and endurance. Epicureans praised moderation and pleasure. Cynics lived in deliberate poverty, challenging norms. Yet ordinary citizens paid little attention, preferring gossip about the latest gladiator or scandalous senator. A wit once declared that philosophers taught wisdom, while Rome listened politely, then hurried to the circus. Philosophy had prestige, but entertainment had attendance. Emperors themselves sometimes dabbled in philosophy. Marcus Aurelius wrote meditations reminding himself to remain calm, humble, and mindful of duty. His writings still echo today, yet even he could not escape war and plague. His reign proved that wisdom could soothe the mind, but not always save the body. Rome admired virtue, but rarely rewarded it. Across the empire, local cultures endured beneath Roman veneer. Celtic festivals, Egyptian rituals, Jewish traditions, Greek philosophies, all coexisted, sometimes blending, sometimes clashing. Rome's genius was not erasure, but absorption. It allowed diversity, as long as taxes arrived and loyalty to the emperor remained. One governor noted, "The gods may vary, but the coin is always the same." In homes, families gathered for simple meals, bread dipped in olive oil, beans stewed with herbs, cheese softened with honey, wine diluted with water. Children played with carved dolls, dice, or hoops. Parents told stories of ancestors or recited lines of Virgil. Life was not always glamorous, but it was steady. For most Romans, stability mattered more than conquest. Night brought its own dangers. Streets unlit, patrolled by a few watchmen, became hunting grounds for thieves. Taverns filled with drunks shouting songs. Apartment walls rattled with noise. The wealthy retreated behind gates. The poor prayed their doors held fast. Rome glittered by day, but after sundown, its shadows stretched long. One poet remarked that daylight belonged to gods, but night belonged to thieves, and Rome proved him right. And still, life pulsed. The empire carried on, not because it was perfect, but because it never stopped moving. Legions marched, merchants sold, priests sacrificed, poets mocked, and crowds roared. Rome endured. For all its contradictions, it held together like a mosaic, broken pieces arranged into a pattern that somehow dazzled. The 3rd century brought storms that tested the empire more than any before. Emperors rose and fell so quickly that citizens joked they could not remember names before the statues were toppled. Some ruled only months, others days. Soldiers declared their generals emperors, marched on Rome, and then lost battles that ended their reigns as fast as they began. The empire felt less like a single state and more like a revolving door of purple robes. This was the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, when invasions pressed from all sides, plagues struck cities, and civil wars drained strength. Legions loyal to one commander fought legions loyal to another. Provinces broke away to form short-lived rival states. The Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, both briefly stood apart. Rome itself staggered. Many wondered aloud if the Eternal City was finally aging. Amid this chaos, Certain rulers still shone. Aurelian, for instance, clawed the empire back from collapse. He defeated the Gallic usurpers in the west, crushed Palmyra in the east, and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He built massive walls around Rome itself, a sign that even the capital feared assault. Ordinary citizens whispered nervously, for if Rome needed walls now, perhaps gods were no longer enough. Yet even Aurelian met an end soaked in irony. His own officers, fearing punishment for forged documents, murdered him before he could act. Rome seemed to chew through emperors like bread crusts, one finished, another immediately served. A citizen once sighed that emperors died faster than bakers could carve their images into loaves. The economy strained under constant wars. Silver coins grew thin with alloy. Purchasing power fell. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Merchants complained. Citizens hoarded whatever seemed stable. A loaf of bread that once cost a handful of denarii could suddenly cost 50. Inflation was not a modern invention. Rome suffered it with equal confusion and grumbling. Yet culture endured despite instability. Temples still stood. Theaters still staged plays. Amphitheaters still roared with spectacles. Perhaps this was Rome's secret, that even in chaos, its routines continued. Citizens clung to rituals, sacrifices, and entertainment, as if habit itself kept the empire alive. People laughed, argued, and bought olives, even while borders burned. The plagues worsened the burden. The plague of Cyprian, in the mid-3rd century, swept through cities, emptying streets, leaving corpses piled at temples. Bishops described horrors, but also claimed it purified the faithful. Fear ran deep. Some thought gods were angry. Others thought demons roamed unseen. The truth mattered little, for to a Roman family, watching neighbors collapse, explanations were far less important than survival. Strangely, even in plague, humor persisted. One graffiti discovered reads, "We all die, but at least wine makes it fun." It seems even in shadow, Romans never lost their taste for bitter wit. Perhaps that humor was a form of medicine, not curing, but softening pain. While emperors fought wars and plagues, ordinary life stumbled forward. Farmers tilled fields, hoping taxes left them grain to feed families. Craftsmen shaped pottery, sandals, tools. Merchants moved goods along crumbling roads. Soldiers trained, priests sacrificed, mothers scolded children. Life insisted on continuing. The empire's greatness was not only in emperors, but in countless hands refusing to stop working even as thunder loomed. The provinces at this time felt both Roman and not. In Britain, forts lined Hadrian's Wall, but villages nearby kept Celtic gods alive. In Gaul, Latin blended with native tongues until neither sounded entirely foreign. In Egypt, processions still honored Isis with music and incense, while Roman governors counted taxes. The empire was a quilt, stitched with patches that never fully matched, but covered the whole nonetheless. Some emperors embraced diversity. Severus Alexander was said to keep statues of Orpheus, Christ, Abraham, and Apollonius of Tyana in his private shrine. His attempt at inclusivity earned sneers from traditionalists, yet revealed how vast Rome had become when one empire could house so many gods. Perhaps unity mattered less than acceptance. Still, acceptance alone did not keep him alive. He too was slain by soldiers, proving that tolerance was no shield against ambition. Despite turmoil, construction never ceased. Emperors eager to be remembered ordered forums, baths, or triumphal arches. Cities across the empire mirrored Rome, with theaters, markets, and temples. Archaeologists still find inscriptions dedicating buildings to emperors forgotten by history. Men who ruled mere months still carved their names into stone, hoping eternity would remember them. Eternity often did not, but the stones survived anyway. The role of women during these years grew quietly. Empresses and mothers often influenced politics behind curtains. Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, became famous for her intelligence and power. She advised her husband, mediated disputes, and patronized philosophers. Citizens joked that Rome was ruled not by the emperor, but by his wife. A joke, but one with more truth than flattery. For women's hands steered Rome more than statues admitted. Philosophy retained followers even in chaos. Stoicism still guided men toward endurance. Christians began spreading their message of salvation. Despite periodic persecution, pagan and Christian voices argued in streets, debates about gods echoing beside debates about grain prices. Some citizens shrugged, declaring that any god who lowered taxes deserved devotion. Rome's faith was often as practical as it was spiritual. The army remained restless. Commanders declared themselves emperors with alarming speed. Soldiers cared less for dynasties, more for donatives. A general who paid well might be hailed Augustus one week, only to be slain the next when pay ran thin. The purple robe became less a crown, more a target. The Praetorian Guard no longer monopolized assassinations. The legions joined eagerly. Rome's throne felt like a seat carved of wax under desert sun, melting as soon as anyone sat upon it. Still, not every story was grim. Festivals continued. Saturnalia filled streets with laughter and role reversals. Even in dark years, children still played with hoops and dolls. Families still prayed at kitchen shrines. Life wove itself stubbornly between disasters. Perhaps this persistence was Rome's greatest talent. Its empire did not endure through strength alone, but through citizens who laughed even while walls cracked. The arts reflected uncertainty. Poets wrote of decline. Historians lamented lost virtue. Satirists sharpened pens, mocking emperors for vanity, merchants for greed, senators for cowardice. Humor became sharper. like knives against corruption. Rome could be cruel, but it could also laugh at itself with brutal honesty. A city that mocked even its emperors perhaps had resilience hidden in laughter. By the late 3rd century, a reform arrived in the form of Diocletian, a soldier risen from obscurity. He reorganized the empire into the tetrarchy, 4 rulers instead of 1. Each governed a section, sharing power to lighten the burden. The system looked clever on scrolls, though in practice, egos cracked it apart eventually. Still, for a time, Rome breathed again, and Diocletian's order stabilized chaos. He also unleashed the largest persecution of Christians, ordering churches destroyed, scriptures burned, believers arrested. Yet the faith endured, perhaps strengthened by suffering. A strange irony. Emperors who tried to erase Christianity instead gave it martyrs, and martyrs wrote history more deeply than decrees. Diocletian eventually retired, growing cabbages in his villa. When asked to return to power, he refused, preferring vegetables to politics. Rome perhaps envied him for it. Architecture under Diocletian flourished. His palace at Split in Dalmatia became a fortress-like residence, blending luxury with military order. Part palace, part camp. It symbolized Rome's new reality. No longer carefree opulence, but guarded strength. The empire was still mighty, but wary, as if shadows lengthened over its marble. Economy remained fragile, but reform stabilized currency briefly. Edicts tried to control prices, though merchants ignored them. Farmers hoarded grain. Soldiers demanded pay. Inflation still lurked. Yet Rome persisted. Its markets still filled. Its forums still debated. Its amphitheaters still roared. In Rome, collapse was always predicted, yet daily life continued. One could still stroll the forum, hear orators argue cases, watch children chase dogs, smell bread baking in corner shops, even as legions marched to distant wars. The contrast defined Rome, doom predicted in marble halls. The rise of Constantine marked a turning point in the empire's story. Born into the turbulence of the late 3rd century, he emerged as one of the many generals vying for power. Yet unlike most of his rivals, he endured, not merely by sword, but by vision. Constantine understood that Rome could no longer be governed as it once had. He reached for new symbols, and in doing so, reshaped the empire itself. His ascent came through wars against other claimants. Battles stretched across provinces. Armies clashed. Cities burned. In the year 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine faced Maxentius. Ancient sources tell us that before the battle, he saw a sign in the sky, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "In this sign conquer." Whether vision or invention, Constantine marked his soldiers' shields with Christian symbols and marched to victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome triumphant. The story of the vision spread rapidly. Supporters praised it as divine favor. Critics muttered it was propaganda painted in the clouds. Regardless, Constantine embraced Christianity, not fully abandoning old gods, but elevating the new faith to unprecedented heights. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted tolerance to Christians, ending centuries of persecution. For the first time, Christianity stood not as a hunted sect, but as a faith supported by imperial decree. Many Romans were bewildered. Temples to Jupiter and Mars still stood. Sacrifices still smoked on altars. Yet suddenly bishops strolled confidently in public. Churches rose beside shrines. Priests of the old cults grumbled, but had little choice. Some joked bitterly that the gods had been retired, like old senators shuffled off to villas. Rome's spiritual marketplace now had a new favored vendor. Constantine proved practical as well as visionary. He reorganized administration, strengthened the army, and most dramatically, founded a new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of Byzantium. He chose it for its strategic harbor and defensible position. The city gleamed with palaces, forums, and churches. Some citizens muttered that Rome itself had been abandoned. Yet Constantine insisted the empire needed two hearts now, one in the west, one in the east. The move proved prophetic, for as centuries passed, Constantinople endured even when Rome faltered. Its walls defied sieges, its wealth dazzled traders. Constantine's gamble ensured that Rome's spirit lived on long after the city of Rome itself stumbled. Perhaps this was his greatest gift, not merely winning battles, but building a future beyond marble ruins. Religion under Constantine shifted further. He summoned bishops to councils, most famously the Council of Nicaea, where debates about Christ's nature erupted with such passion that one bishop allegedly slapped another. It was perhaps the only council where holy men fought like gladiators. The Nicene Creed emerged, a unifying declaration of Christian belief. Constantine himself presided, more referee than theologian, proving that emperors could still dominate even when the subject was divinity. Yet Constantine was not entirely saintly. He executed his own son Crispus under suspicious circumstances, and later his wife Fausta as well. Rumors spread of intrigue, adulteries, and palace conspiracies. His supporters downplayed it. His critics whispered eagerly. Even a Christian emperor could not escape Rome's favorite pastime: scandal. Taxes grew heavier under Constantine's reforms. Land surveys expanded, coins revalued. Officials squeezed provinces with greater efficiency than ever before. Some farmers fled land to avoid burdens. Others joined bandits roaming countryside. The state chased them relentlessly, for emperors discovered what senators had long known: armies might win wars, but taxes won survival. The army under Constantine shifted as well. Cavalry became more important, infantry less dominant. New enemies required new tactics. Gothic horsemen pressed from forests. Persians fielded armored cavalry in the east. Rome adapted, building flexible armies. Yet soldiers grumbled as always about rations, discipline, and endless marching. One wit claimed the empire needed philosophers less than it needed better boots, for soldiers thought more of blisters than of Plato. Christianity's rise altered daily rhythm. Sunday became a day of rest. Bishops gained influence. Churches became community centers. For the poor, the faith offered charity and hope. For the elite, it offered new avenues of prestige. Donations to churches polished reputations as surely as monuments once did. Romans once sacrificed bulls to Jupiter. Now they built basilicas to Christ. The scenery changed, but the ambition remained. Pagan temples did not vanish overnight. In rural areas, farmers still prayed to Saturn for harvests. Fishermen still sacrificed to Neptune before voyages. Shrines to local gods continued quietly. Some emperors even allowed dual worship. Constantine himself issued coins with Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, beside Christian symbols. For a time, Rome walked with two sets of gods, as if hedging bets. The city of Rome, meanwhile, felt its role slipping. Once the center of all, now it became a stage for nostalgia. Senators clung to traditions, staging old festivals with fewer crowds. Emperors visited, but no longer stayed. The Senate still met, but real power drifted eastward. Romans muttered that their city was still eternal, but increasingly eternal in memory rather than in might. Constantinople thrived instead. Its harbor teemed with ships. Merchants hawked silks, spices, and wines. Walls rose taller than Rome's. Palaces gleamed with mosaics. Its streets carried both Latin and Greek voices, blending east and west. The empire had shifted quietly, yet decisively. What had once been purely Roman now wore many faces. Military threats remained constant. In the east, Persians challenged relentlessly. In the north, Gothic tribes tested frontiers. Raids scarred provinces. Refugees fled south. Cities fortified walls. Rome discovered that survival meant constant vigilance. Peace was never permanent, only purchased between battles. A farmer might plant in spring, yet always wonder if autumn harvest would be trampled by invaders. The empire's humor never dimmed despite danger. Inscriptions from the period mock tax collectors. One reads, "Better to be a barbarian than a Roman farmer, for the barbarian loses once, the farmer every year." Bitter, but accurate. Citizens may have suffered under wars, but at least they could still insult bureaucracy with style. Architecture continued evolving. Basilicas rose across cities, vast halls with high roofs and wide spaces, designed for worship, but echoing Roman engineering. Old temples were repurposed into churches, statues of gods quietly dismantled. mosaics replaced with crosses. Yet sometimes the old and new mingled awkwardly. A church might stand beside a temple, both claiming sanctity. Rome became less uniform, more layered, like parchment written over again and again. Philosophy adjusted too. Christian thinkers debated faith, blending Greek ideas with scripture. Augustine would later emerge, shaping Western thought for centuries. For now, bishops argued endlessly whether Christ was man, God, or both. Ordinary citizens often shrugged, more concerned with bread prices. Soldiers cared only whether their pay arrived. Philosophical quarrels made grand sermons, but did little to quiet growling stomachs. Constantine's later years saw him baptized shortly before death, a gesture that sealed his image as Rome's first Christian emperor. Supporters hailed him as chosen. Critics whispered of hypocrisy. He left an empire changed forever, where crosses rose where eagles once spread wings. His successors would inherit both his strength and his contradictions. His sons divided the empire among themselves, squabbling, fighting, betraying. Rome's old story repeated again. Unity frayed whenever inheritance arrived. Provinces grew weary of endless civil wars. Soldiers tired of swearing loyalty to new emperors every spring. The empire endured, but cracks widened. The barbarians, once minor nuisances, grew bolder. Goths, Franks, and Vandals pressed deeper into Roman lands. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they settled as foederati, allies bound by treaties. Rome discovered that conquering enemies was easier than feeding allies. Clashes flared. Alliances broke. Borders blurred. The empire was less fortress, more civ. Even so, daily life remained strangely familiar. Children played, merchants sold, bakers baked. Even as armies fought at borders, Rome's core clung to habit. Perhaps that is why the empire lasted so long. It could lose battles, lose emperors, even lose gods, and still keep its routines. Continuity mattered more than victory. As centuries turned, the balance between old and new tipped further. Pagan temples grew quiet. Christian basilicas filled. Bishops claimed moral authority, often rivaling governors. Faith and politics tangled inseparably. Some citizens sighed that Rome had traded Jupiter's thunderbolt for sermons, but thunder and sermons both kept people in line. The 4th century carried Rome into a twilight that glowed as much with brilliance as with shadow. Constantine's reforms lingered. His city of Constantinople thrived, yet the old city of Rome itself felt more like a monument than a throne. Emperors visited, but fewer stayed. Senators clung to rituals like moss on fading marble. Citizens still cheered games, but they knew power was drifting eastward, The barbarians at the borders grew restless. Goths pressed down from forests. Vandals hovered near rivers. Franks tested Rhine defenses. Each tribe was not merely a horde, but a collection of families, warriors, and chieftains seeking land. Rome saw them as invaders, but often they were refugees, displaced by other migrations deeper in Europe. The empire became less fortress and more floodplain. Strangers kept arriving, and the gates were never wide enough to sort them peacefully. In 376, the Visigoths, fleeing pressure from the Huns, begged to cross the Danube into Roman lands. The empire allowed them in as foederati, allies bound by treaty, yet officials abused them, sold them dog meat at high prices, demanded bribes, and starved their families. Desperation turned to rage, and soon the Goths rose in rebellion. The empire discovered that mistreating guests was a poor recipe for friendship. 2 years later came the shock of Adrianople. In 378, when Emperor Valens faced the Goths in battle, he refused to wait for reinforcements, eager for glory, and marched his legions into disaster. The Goth cavalry crushed Roman lines. Valens himself perished in the chaos, his body never found. Rome reeled. For centuries it had believed its legions invincible. Now barbarians proved otherwise. Citizens whispered that gods had turned their backs. Others muttered the legions had simply grown lazy. The loss forced change. Emperors could no longer pretend barbarians were nuisances. They were now powers to negotiate with, to bribe, to settle on Roman soil. The empire became landlord to tribes it once fought, handing them land in exchange for loyalty. It was practical, but dangerous. For loyalty based on promises of grain and gold rarely lasted longer than the harvest. Meanwhile, Christianity grew stronger. Churches rose across cities. Bishops gained authority, sometimes rivaling governors. Theologians argued endlessly. Debates over Christ's nature, sin, and grace, echoing louder than debates about taxes. One council might declare a doctrine heresy, only for the next emperor to favor it. Ordinary citizens often sighed, for to them, bread mattered more than metaphysics. Rome discovered that religious politics could be as exhausting as senatorial ones. In 391, Emperor Theodosius outlawed pagan rituals. Temples closed, sacrifices banned. The old gods who had guided Rome for centuries faded into memory. Some resisted quietly, praying in secret groves, but public life now marched under the cross. Statues of Jupiter and Venus toppled, replaced with saints and martyrs. Philosophers grumbled that Rome had traded one set of rituals for another. But power rarely listened to philosophers for long. Theodosius also divided the empire between his sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east. The division was meant to preserve strength, but it deepened weakness. For the West had fewer resources, fewer wealthy provinces, and far more vulnerable borders. Constantinople gleamed, while Rome sagged. Some joked that the empire was like a body where the head remained healthy while the legs gave way. Honorius proved no Marcus Aurelius. He preferred safety within Ravenna's marshy fortress, far from Rome itself, his court filled with intrigue and eunuchs whispering schemes. When Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, pressed demands, Honorius hesitated, promised, broke promises, hesitated again. The empire's strength no longer lay in decisive generals, but in timid emperors hoping problems would solve themselves. In 410, the unthinkable occurred. Alaric marched his Goths into Rome. The eternal city, untouched by foreign enemies for 8 centuries, was sacked. Though accounts differ, most agree it was not wanton destruction. Churches were spared. Many citizens survived. Yet the shock reverberated. Rome could fall, and it had. Pagan critics claimed it was punishment for abandoning the old gods. Christians argued it was a test of faith. Ordinary Romans likely muttered that arguments mattered little while roofs burned. The sack lingered in memory. Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, wrote his City of God, arguing that the fall of earthly Rome did not mean the fall of God's kingdom. His words would echo for centuries. Even as the empire crumbled, Rome began to see itself not as eternal in stone, but eternal in spirit. It was a clever adjustment, for stone was clearly less reliable than hoped. After 410, the West limped on. Vandals crossed into Spain, then into North Africa, seizing fertile lands that once fed Rome. Without African grain, the city itself faced hunger. Citizens who once feasted on imported delicacies now relied on dwindling supplies. Some remembered Vespasian's toilet tax with fondness, for at least he had left bread. In 455 came another sack, this time by the Vandals. Led by King Genseric, they stripped treasures, carted off statues, and carried away even the bronze roof tiles of temples. From this event, the word vandalism was born. Though again, violence was less than feared. Many citizens survived, yet the humiliation was lasting. The eternal city was becoming a frequent target, and jokes about eternity grew thin. Amid these blows, the East prospered. Constantinople's walls stood firm. Its emperors maintained fleets and armies strong enough to repel invaders. Wealth flowed through its harbors. Markets thrived with goods from Asia and Africa. Citizens in the East looked westward and shook their heads, wondering how the city that once ruled the world had become a liability. The empire was now 2 siblings, one thriving, the other stumbling. The West sought help from allies it once despised. Foederati tribes fought alongside Roman generals. In some cases, their leaders became kingmakers. Ricimer, a Germanic commander, effectively controlled Western emperors like puppets. He raised them up and deposed them at will. Senators whispered that Rome's emperors now wore crowns, but barbarians pulled the strings. The irony was sharp, for the city that once enslaved nations now begged for protection from their descendants. Daily life reflected the strain. Cities shrank, trade routes faltered, coins debased further, farmers abandoned land, retreating to fortified villas or joining barbarian bands. The grandeur of marble gave way to survival in stone farmhouses, yet still, laughter flickered. A letter survives from a Roman complaining about his neighbor's chickens stealing grain, proving that even as empires collapsed, petty annoyances endured. Education declined in the West, schools closed, libraries fell into disrepair, yet monasteries slowly rose, preserving texts, copying scrolls, storing knowledge for future centuries. Ironically, while senators squabbled and generals fought, monks in dim cells quietly safeguarded Rome's intellectual heritage. The empire's body weakened, but its memory prepared to survive. Amphitheaters grew silent, games dwindled as funds dried, gladiators faded into memory, replaced by bishops preaching sermons. Some citizens missed the roar of the Colosseum, others sighed in relief at quieter streets. Rome learned that silence could be both loss and comfort. The circus still ran, but even its races grew fewer. Citizens once soothed by spectacle now looked to sermons for solace, not because they were better, but because they were available. The empire's humor remained even in decline. One story tells of a tax collector demanding fees from a farmer whose land had been burned. The farmer pointed at the ashes and asked, "Would you like me to pay in smoke?" It was bitter humor, but humor nonetheless. For Romans refused to surrender wit, even when surrendering cities. By the late 5th century, the Western throne had become a formality. Emperors were raised, then discarded, until finally in 476, the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor with the name of Rome's founder and its first emperor, yet ruling only in name, was quietly sent into retirement. No grand speeches, no last stands, just paperwork and exile. The Western Roman Empire ended with more of a sigh than a scream. Yet the Eastern Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, carried the torch. For another 1,000 years it stood, preserving Roman law, art, and tradition. Constantinople remained a beacon. Even as Rome itself faded into ruin, the East kept the legacy alive, proving that the empire's story did not end. It merely shifted. For ordinary citizens in 476, the end may not have felt dramatic. Farmers still plowed, merchants still bargained, families still prayed. The empire's fall was less apocalypse, more erosion. Stones crumbled slowly, but lives continued. The grandeur of Rome had dimmed, but life itself endured. And so the Roman Empire, once invincible, had become history, yet its echoes lingered, in roads still walked, in laws still studied, in languages still spoken. Rome did not vanish. It transformed into kingdoms, churches, and memories. A mosaic shattered, but pieces scattered across the world. Though the Western Empire fell in 476, the story of Rome was not over. For in the East, the Byzantine Empire carried on. Its citizens called themselves Romans still, and for them, the empire had not ended, merely adjusted its capital and its wardrobe. Instead of togas, silk robes shimmered. Instead of marble forums, gilded churches rose. The old spirit survived, even if the accent had changed. Constantinople, founded by Constantine, stood as the new Rome. Its harbor, called the Golden Horn, bustled with ships from every corner, bringing silks from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and amber from the Baltic. Its walls, thick and towering, became legend. Defenders claimed no enemy could breach them. And for nearly 1,000 years, they were right. Ordinary citizens lived within those walls, knowing that even gods might envy such defenses. The city gleamed with Hagia Sophia, a church so vast that when completed under Justinian, it stunned visitors into silence. Its dome floated as if suspended by heaven itself. Light streamed through windows. Gilded mosaics sparkled with saints. One foreign visitor declared he did not know whether he stood on earth or in heaven. Locals smiled politely, but also muttered that it leaked occasionally when it rained. Even glory in Constantinople needed repairs. Justinian, ruling in the 6th century, dreamed of restoring Rome's old empire. His generals, Belisarius and Narcissus, reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. Victories dazzled citizens, yet the wars drained coffers. And when plague struck, the dream dimmed. The plague of Justinian, carried perhaps by rats and fleas, killed millions. The empire staggered. Some claimed half the population vanished. Priests said God was testing them. Citizens sighed, for whether test or curse. It left the streets far quieter than anyone desired. Yet Justinian left more than conquests. He codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a compilation that shaped Europe for centuries. Lawyers rejoiced. Citizens groaned, for even organized law was still law. One wit remarked that Justinian's code did not lessen disputes. It merely gave people thicker books to argue over. Still, it became one of the empire's greatest legacies. Constantinople remained a city of spectacle. Hippodrome races continued the old Roman love of chariots. The blues and greens dominated factions. Their rivalries sometimes erupted into riots. In 532, the Nika riots nearly toppled Justinian himself. Crowds shouted Nika, meaning victory. burning buildings and storming palaces. Justinian considered fleeing, but his wife Theodora allegedly declared, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." He stayed. Belisarius slaughtered thousands in the hippodrome, and Justinian's throne survived. It was perhaps the only time an empire was saved by both a general's sword and a woman's sharp tongue. Theodora herself remains one of history's more fascinating figures, rising from humble origins, possibly even from the theater. She became empress and wielded power fearlessly. She pushed for legal reforms protecting women, resisted officials who wavered in crises, and matched Justinian in ambition. Citizens whispered about her past with both scorn and admiration. Some called her shameless, others called her savior. Perhaps she was both, which made her thoroughly Roman. Religion continued to dominate life in Byzantium, but arguments grew sharper. Debates over Christ's nature split churches. Monophysites argued one way, Chalcedonians another. Councils met, decrees issued, and still quarrels raged. A foreign observer might have laughed that Romans once fought for provinces. Now they fought for syllables. Yet in those syllables, identities and loyalties hardened, proving that words could wound more deeply than swords. Art flourished despite disputes. Icons of saints and Christ-filled churches, painted in gold and deep colors. Some saw them as windows to heaven, others as idolatry. The iconoclast controversy erupted, emperors ordering icons destroyed, monks defending them fiercely. Mosaics were torn down, only to be restored later. Citizens joked that at least artists had steady employment, for whether breaking or painting, the empire always needed them. The empire's enemies never rested. Persians to the east, Slavs to the north, and later Arabs pressing swiftly with armies fueled by new faith. Battles raged, cities fell, borders shifted. Yet Constantinople's walls and fleets of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that burned even on water, kept the capital safe. Enemies cursed it as devil's flame. Citizens blessed it as God's gift. No one outside ever discovered its recipe, which made it the empire's best-kept kitchen's secret. Life in Constantinople bustled beyond wars. Markets brimmed with goods. Bakers sold loaves shaped in patterns. Fishermen hauled catches from the Bosporus. Silk weavers spun cloth so fine it glimmered. Pilgrims shuffled through churches with candles. Pickpockets slipped among them with equal devotion. A traveler could hear Greek, Latin, Armenian, Arabic, and countless dialects in one street. The empire was less Roman by blood, but more Roman by variety, absorbing and surviving through diversity. The provinces reflected this mix. In Anatolia, farmers grew wheat. In Syria, traders moved caravans across deserts. In Egypt, grain still fed the capital, though now bound for Constantinople rather than Rome. In the Balkans, soldiers stood watch at forts against northern tribes. The empire's borders shifted constantly, but its core endured. As long as its roads remained open and its taxes collected, the lesson was unchanged. Bread and coin held empires more tightly than swords. Bureaucracy became the empire's true spine. Emperors came and went. Generals won and lost, but officials with scrolls endured. Tax records piled high, decrees written, sealed, and archived. Citizens groaned that one could fight barbarians with less effort than navigate Byzantine paperwork. Yet paperwork proved durable. And even when cities burned, scribes often emerged clutching chests of documents, as if parchment itself mattered more than people. Humor slipped through cracks of pomp. Chroniclers record citizens mocking emperors. One claimed a ruler's beard contained more wisdom than his brain. Another joked that the hippodrome factions cared more about horses than theology, perhaps because horses at least ran in circles reliably. For all its majesty, Byzantium remained thoroughly human, filled with laughter in taverns, arguments in markets, and gossip in bathhouses. Emperors continued to be colorful. Heraclius, in the 7th century, fought Persians, then Arabs, carrying the true cross back to Jerusalem after victories. He returned in triumph, only to face new invasions immediately. His reign proved that glory in Byzantium often lasted no longer than a parade. Citizens clapped in the morning and complained by evening when taxes rose again. Byzantine society blended luxury with austerity. The elite dined on spices and wines, while monks retreated into barren deserts. Icons glittered in churches, while hermits starved in caves to prove holiness. Contrasts sharpened, but the empire contained them all. Perhaps its resilience came from balancing opposites: piety with extravagance, strength with fragility, laughter with lament. Education endured strongly. Scholars preserved classical texts, copied manuscripts, debated philosophy. Constantinople's schools taught rhetoric, law, and theology. The empire became a bridge between antiquity and medieval Europe. Without its scribes, many works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer might have vanished. Ironically, while emperors battled barbarians, monks and scholars preserved the memory of Greece and Rome, ensuring that even if walls crumbled, words would not. Foreign visitors marveled at the city. Vikings called it Miklagard, the great city. Arabs named it the city of the Caesar. Pilgrims gasped at its churches. Merchants haggled in its markets. Diplomats returned home dazzled by its ceremonies. The Byzantines loved elaborate rituals. Emperors crowned with processions of gold. Officials bowing in choreographed dances of authority. Outsiders thought it theatrical. But Byzantines believed ritual itself was power. If one could convince others of majesty, then majesty became real. Through centuries, Constantinople endured sieges, earthquakes, fires, yet always rebuilt. Citizens said the city was guarded by the Virgin herself. Its survival seemed miraculous, perhaps because its walls and fleets worked miracles of engineering. Yet no wall lasts forever, and storms of history never sleep. The Byzantines knew this, even as they walked confidently through markets, glancing at towers rising against the sky. The empire that called itself Roman still thrived in Constantinople. But centuries rolled on, and like all long stories, it grew tangled. After Justinian's triumphs came leaner years. Provinces slipped away, borders shrank, yet the city endured. Its walls stood like stone prayers, whispered day after day against invading armies. By the 9th century, new challenges tested the empire. Arab fleets prowled the seas. Slavic tribes settled in the Balkans. Bulgars rose with kings who dared challenge Constantinople itself. The Byzantines fought with a mix of cunning, treaties, and occasional bribes wrapped politely as gifts. Some said their diplomacy was stronger than their swords, and that envoys armed with coin and promises did more than generals. It was cheaper too, though accountants still groaned at the bills. The Macedonian dynasty emerged in this era, bringing a golden stretch of revival. Under emperors like Basil the Sen, the empire expanded once more, regaining lands in the Balkans and pushing back enemies. Basil earned the nickname the Bulgar Slayer, though one imagines Bulgarians were less enthusiastic about the title. He reigned for decades, ruling with relentless discipline. He taxed heavily, drilled armies constantly, and gave little space for corruption. Well, less corruption than usual. For in Byzantium, erasing corruption entirely was as likely as erasing pigeons from statues. Basil's reign left the empire wealthy and strong, but as always, successors squandered stability. Weak rulers, court intrigues, and nobles more concerned with land disputes than borders, eroded strength again. A farmer in Anatolia might shrug, for emperors rose and fell, but his field demanded planting no matter the politics. Yet even farmers noticed when raiders burned crops, reminding them that borders mattered after all. The court of Constantinople grew increasingly elaborate. Ceremonies stretched into hours. Emperors processed with jeweled robes. Officials prostrated in carefully rehearsed choreography. Visitors described thrones that rose mechanically into the air, golden lions that roared, and mechanical birds that sang. Diplomats gawked, muttering that Byzantium was half empire, half puppet show. But the Byzantines believed deeply that performance itself created authority. If people bowed long enough, they eventually forgot to stand. Religion still anchored life. Monks filled monasteries across mountains and valleys, praying, copying manuscripts, and sometimes squabbling over whether bread at communion should be leavened or unleavened. Arguments over yeast may sound dull, but in Byzantium, they sparked riots. Citizens poured into streets to defend their chosen dough, proving that in this empire, theology could move crowds more effectively than tax law. Icons returned triumphantly after the age of iconoclasm. Churches once stripped bare now glittered again with mosaics and paintings. Golden saints stared serenely from domes. Candles flickered beneath their eyes. Pilgrims shuffled to kiss panels, some leaving behind greasy smudges that horrified caretakers. Still, faith felt closer with faces watching. The people rejoiced. Artists rejoiced, and one suspects candle vendors rejoiced most of all. Meanwhile, ordinary life in the city remained crowded and lively. Streets twisted with markets, sellers hawking fish still gasping from the Bosporus, spices sharp enough to make eyes water, fabrics dyed purple for those who could afford extravagance. Carts rattled, beggars stretched hands, cats prowled for scraps. The city smelled of bread, sweat, and incense, a blend equal parts sacred and ordinary. Some travelers complained of filth, others of noise, but many still gasped at its size. For Constantinople dwarfed other cities of Europe like a lion among house cats. Foreigners poured in too. Vikings, called Varangians in the empire, traveled down rivers to trade furs and slaves. Many entered imperial service, forming the famous Varangian Guard, tall warriors with axes, sworn to protect the emperor. They became both bodyguards and spectacle. Citizens whispered in awe at their height and their blunt honesty. A courtier once muttered that Varangians were loyal because they spoke too little Greek to join intrigues. Perhaps loyalty is easier when one cannot understand gossip. The empire's reach stretched beyond war. Missionaries traveled to Slavic lands, bringing Christianity to Rus and Bulgaria. Saints, Cyril and Methodius, created alphabets, laying foundations for languages still written today. In spreading faith, Byzantium extended its cultural shadow, even when armies could not march. Scholars joked that sometimes scrolls conquered more effectively than swords, though admittedly swords were faster. Trade flowed constantly through Constantinople. Ships docked daily, unloading grain, silk, ivory, and timber. The government taxed everything with enthusiasm, ensuring revenue flowed into coffers. Some merchants grumbled that the empire taxed the air itself, and indeed tolls existed for bridges, harbors, and even market stalls. Bureaucrats smiled and inked another line into ledgers, for if swords defended walls, taxes defended paydays. Yet storms gathered again. By the 11th century, the empire faced new enemies. The Seljuk Turks surged from the east. Their cavalry smashed Byzantine armies at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The defeat was shattering. Anatolia, once the empire's heartland of soldiers and grain, slipped from grasp. Panic swept Constantinople. Some muttered the empire was doomed. Others reassured themselves with faith in the walls. The truth lay somewhere between confidence and despair. The loss at Manzikert forced desperate measures. Emperors called for aid from the West, appealing to fellow Christians in Europe. The plea helped spark the Crusades. Western knights arrived, armored, pious, and occasionally bewildered by Byzantine ceremony. They admired the wealth of the city, though some eyed it a bit too hungrily. Byzantines smiled politely, while quietly calculating the risks of hosting guests with swords and appetites. The First Crusade succeeded in retaking Jerusalem, and Byzantines regained lands temporarily. Yet the alliance was uneasy. Western knights called Byzantines deceitful. Byzantines called knights unruly barbarians in shiny mail. Both were correct. Still, for a time, interests aligned, proving that distrust could march beside convenience. Life within Constantinople continued regardless of wars. Families gathered in courtyards. Children learned letters from monks. Bakers rose before dawn to knead bread. The city hummed, as it always had. Citizens joked that emperors might come and go, but cats ruled the streets forever. Indeed, cats became an unofficial emblem of the city, praised for keeping rats away, though also blamed for stealing fish straight from market stalls. The arts thrived. Churches glittered with frescoes. Mosaics shimmered with gold. Writers composed histories of emperors and saints. Poets wrote hymns. Music echoed in liturgies. Though politics faltered, culture soared. Visitors left dazzled, convinced the empire was still rich and mighty. Few noticed that beneath golden domes, the treasury sometimes rattled hollow. Byzantium survived on display as much as substance. The 12th century saw emperors like the Komnenoi restore strength briefly. Alexios, John, and Manuel, skillful rulers who balanced diplomacy with war. They married into Western dynasties, fought Turks and Normans alike, and filled palaces with glittering ceremonies. Chroniclers wrote admiringly, yet cracks remained. The empire depended heavily on mercenaries, and debts grew. Strength looked real, but foundations wobbled. The true disaster arrived with the Fourth Crusade. In 1204, Western knights diverted from Jerusalem and stormed Constantinople itself, the city that had resisted Persians, Arabs, and Bulgars for centuries. Fell to fellow Christians. Looting lasted days, churches stripped of relics, palaces gutted, mosaics torn down, horses of bronze dragged to Venice. Citizens watched in horror. Some whispered the apocalypse had come. Others muttered simply that nothing was eternal except betrayal. The Latin Empire installed by Crusaders stumbled from the start. Byzantines never accepted it. Resistance simmered, and within decades, exiled emperors from Nicaea retook Constantinople. In 1261, the city was restored to Byzantine hands, but it never recovered fully. Treasuries drained, population shrank, defenses weakened. The empire survived, but as a shadow of its former self. And yet, life went on. Markets reopened. Children played. Priests sang hymns. The city endured despite scars. A citizen joked that Constantinople was like an old actor, robbed of youth but still performing, hoping applause would cover wrinkles. The show continued, even as the stage creaked. The late empire leaned heavily on diplomacy. Emperors played Turks against Venetians, Genoese against Bulgars, promising alliances they rarely kept. Outsiders mocked Byzantine politics as labyrinthine, yet it worked often enough to delay disaster. As one observer noted, the Byzantines fight more with pens than swords. A compliment, though also a warning, for pens rarely stopped armies forever. By the 14th century, the Ottomans rose, swallowing lands swiftly. Fortresses fell, villages converted allegiance overnight. Constantinople remained proud, but surrounded, like an island in a rising tide. It stood firm, but the water crept higher each year. Citizens prayed, bishops preached, emperors begged for aid. Yet Europe often looked away, too busy with its own wars and plagues. Still, the empire clung to life. Scholars taught in its schools, manuscripts copied faithfully, mosaics repaired even in emptying churches. Some called it stubbornness, others called it faith. Either way, Byzantium refused to vanish quietly. The world might forget it for moments, but it remembered itself every sunrise. For even fading empires wake each day until the final one. The last centuries of the empire often felt like watching a flame flicker low, smaller than before, yet somehow refusing to die. Constantinople's streets still bustled, though fewer people walked them. Its churches still glittered with mosaics, though cracks crept across the walls. Its emperors still wore crowns, though they ruled little beyond the shadow of their palace. And yet, each morning, the city's bells rang, as if insisting that Rome still breathed. The Palaiologos dynasty, restored after 1261, tried to hold the empire together. They repaired Hagia Sophia, revived ceremonies, and assured citizens that the empire's glory would return. The optimism was touching, though reality less so. Land slipped away steadily. Greece fractured into rival lords. Anatolia long gone to Turks. The treasury remained thin. Diplomats joked that the empire produced more titles than soldiers, and the joke carried sting because it was true. Still, Constantinople enchanted travelers. Italian merchants gawked at its markets. Pilgrims crossed its bridges, whispering awe at golden domes. Scholars praised its libraries, housing texts copied faithfully for centuries. For while armies dwindled, Byzantium became a keeper of memory, a vault of words, preserving the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Even as its body weakened, its mind remained sharp. Some wondered if perhaps that was its true destiny, not to conquer, but to remember. The Ottomans pressed harder each year, their armies disciplined, their sultans ambitious, their cannons terrifying. They seized towns and fortresses one by one, choking the empire like ivy around stone. Byzantines resisted when they could, bribed when they must, and prayed always. A soldier might joke that the empire now measured victory in months rather than miles, and victories grew rare. Emperors traveled west begging for aid. Promises were made, councils convened, debates shouted, yet help rarely arrived. Western Europe admired Constantinople's beauty, but rarely sent more than a trickle of knights. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches lingered like an old wound, healed with words on paper but never with trust. Citizens of Constantinople resented Rome, Rome resented them, and while Christians argued over creeds, the Ottomans marched. In the 14th century, the city shrank so much that farmers planted crops within its walls. Neighborhoods collapsed into fields. Goats grazed where markets once bustled. Constantinople was still grand at its center, but empty at its edges, like a cloak worn thin. Emperors still processed in purple robes, though their courts sometimes resembled village feasts more than imperial splendor. And yet, the people clung to ceremony, for ceremony gave dignity even when armies could not. Humor survived even here. Chroniclers note citizens quipping that at least Constantinople would never fall, because no one could bother to conquer so little. A cruel joke. Yet perhaps laughter helped soften dread. One merchant wrote that people still argued about bread prices as if nothing had changed, proving again that even in decline, ordinary life refused to bow. By the 15th century, the empire was nearly gone. Constantinople itself, a jewel surrounded by Ottoman lands, stood like an island of memory. Emperor Constantine XI, last of his name, ruled with courage but little power. He repaired walls, begged allies for aid, and prepared as best he could. He was no Augustus, no Justinian, but perhaps bravery mattered more than conquest now, for his was the empire's final chapter. In 1453, Mehmed II, young Sultan of the Ottomans, brought his armies to the walls, tens of thousands of soldiers, fleets of ships, and cannons so massive they shook the earth, encircled the city. The siege lasted weeks. As Byzantines fought desperately, citizens prayed in Hagia Sophia, soldiers patched walls nightly, priests preached that angels would descend to save them, but angels remained stubbornly absent. The great cannon battered walls relentlessly. Stones fell, towers cracked, defenders strained. Yet Constantinople held longer than many expected. Small bands of Genoese allies fought alongside Byzantines. Citizens carried stones and arrows. Women tended wounded. Even children hauled water. The city gave everything it had, which by then was mostly courage. On May 29th, the walls finally gave way. Ottoman soldiers surged through breaches, fighting street by street, Emperor Constantine XI is said to have thrown off imperial robes, fighting as a soldier until he fell. His body never truly identified, his fate more legend than fact. Some whispered he turned to marble beneath the gates, waiting to rise again. Myths clung to him, for perhaps myth was kinder than reality. Hagia Sophia filled with terrified citizens, praying for miracles. When Ottoman soldiers entered, the church became mosque, bells silenced, crosses lowered, icons veiled. The empire that had called itself Roman for over 1,000 years in the East finally ended. No proclamation, no ceremony, just walls broken and banners raised. Yet even in that fall, something endured. The Ottomans admired the city's beauty and preserved much of it. Hagia Sophia remained, its dome now echoing with new prayers. The city itself became capital of another empire, still vibrant, still powerful, still eternal in a different tongue. Constantinople became Istanbul, but the stones still whispered Rome's story. The legacy of Byzantium stretched beyond ruins. Scholars fleeing the fall carried manuscripts west, sparking the Renaissance. Greek texts long preserved in Constantinople suddenly inspired Italy and beyond. Rome's memory sparked Europe's rebirth. Ironically, the empire's collapse breathed new life into others. Perhaps history delights in irony, for endings often seed beginnings. For citizens who lived through 1453, the fall must have felt like the end of the world. Yet life continued. Bakers baked for new rulers. Markets reopened under new banners. Children laughed in streets as they always had. Empires may fall, but daily life endures stubbornly. Rome's long twilight simply shifted to another dawn. Looking back, the Roman Empire lasted for over a millennium in the West, and another in the East. Longer than perhaps any power has a right to. It changed languages, gods, capitals, but never its identity. Always Roman, even when Romans themselves forgot what that meant. It survived because people clung to habit, ceremony, and the belief that tomorrow could still be Roman. And though Constantinople fell, Rome's spirit outlived walls and crowns. In law, in language, in faith, in the very stories whispered tonight. We remember emperors both noble and foolish, battles both glorious and disastrous, citizens both poor and proud, because their lives shaped our own world quietly. Roads still follow Roman paths. Languages still bend from Latin roots. Churches still echo with Byzantine hymns. So as we drift away from this long journey, imagine the walls of Constantinople standing against the dawn, the sea beyond glittering with ships, the streets below filled with voices, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in laughter, some in prayer. The empire has ended, but the story has not. For Rome lives wherever memory lingers. This is Ancient After Dark, and the journey has reached its close. May the echoes of Rome travel with you into rest, steady, quiet, eternal.